In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at using pan pastels, and I'll be using a basic set here of just a few colors. We're going to be mixing the colors. I've also got it in a little carrier, and they kind of look like little makeup containers. We're also going to be applying it with these devices that resemble painting knives and will allow us to apply the pastel much more like a brush. They also have replacement covers here, kind of a spongy material that they're made of. They can be cleaned with a paper towel. There's also a couple of applicators that came with the set that I got here that kind of resemble makeup applicators. We're going to start by using one of the applicators, and we're just going to dip it into the different pastels. We're going to mix a light blue here and start applying it to the orange pastel paper that I'm working on. I'm concentrating on creating the illusion of brush strokes as I apply the pastel, which I've found is actually one of the benefits to using the pan pastels. As opposed to typical pastels, it's a little easier to create those brush strokes since you're actually dipping the applicator into the container of pan pastels, and then the marks that you make, it almost forces you to create brush stroke type marks, which might be something that you're after here. I'm going to be working the sky back and forth, just looking for lighter areas where the clouds exist and making those shapes here as I apply the pan pastels to the surface. I'm also going back and forth between the blue and the white to create those different areas of color. Now I've switched over to one of the knife type applicators, and this one has a filbert end, which is very much like a filbert brush. And I'm just going to be adding some details here and there, again using the white and the blue to do so. Around the edges of the clouds there is somewhat of a transition, so I'm going to go back and accentuate that just a bit. Now we're ready to move on to the middle ground, so I'm going to mix up some green, just going back and forth between the blue and the yellow. Then I'll simply start working that color into the surface, trying to match the overall shape that's created by the grouping of trees here in the middle ground. Now to make the value a little bit darker, I'm going to mix it with a bit of black. And if you just put the black on the surface, you'll immediately notice it's very strong, but as you work it into the surface, it will mix with the colors that are already there, and it will make that black a little less intense. Now throughout this painting, I'm going to look for opportunities to exploit colors and maybe deviate a little bit from the colors that are observed in the photo reference. So what I mean by this is I'm going to be placing observed colors into the painting that I'm creating, but I'm also going to be exaggerating some of the colors that I see. For example, I'm adding a bit of blue here, and I don't necessarily see that blue in the photo reference, but it's going to translate nicely in the shaded areas. Now, if you want to create a line here, I'm using the edge of the applicator, just like you would the edge of a knife if you were using a knife for painting. Create a few tree trunks there in the distance. And then I'll just continue to look at spaces of value and color and mix those up on my palette and apply them to the surface. Slowly I'm working the values, the contrast in the values getting darker, working that darker value into the surface, and then going back on top of it with some lighter values. If you're a very detail-oriented artist and you're looking to loosen things up, this is a great way to force you to do that. I'm one of those artists, so using the pan pastels forces me not to focus on details, but rather the values and colors and shapes that I see in the photo reference and attempt to put those in the painting. There's a tree off in the distance that has a few branches that are very noticeable. So I'm going to use the edge to create a few lines, and as I was mentioning before, it's very difficult to get the details. So you can see there's a bit of struggle there as I'm trying to create these details, which I'll go back and loosen that area up just a bit. With each stroke or with each application of the material you make on the surface, you can really tell that it translates as brush strokes, and as you build up those colors, you create more depth in the color, more interest in the painting. So it's important to be patient during the process and not stop too early and say to yourself, well, this doesn't necessarily look the way I want it to. Well, sometimes you just have to work through those feelings of doubt and continue to work and continue to build up the colors until you find a place where you're happy with what you've done. Using the side of the applicator, we'll add a few more tree trunks off in the distance. And really this is a process of layering colors on top of each other until you get the level of depth that you're happy with. Keep in mind that there are not necessarily a set of rules that you have to follow when you're using the pan pastels. So when you're making strokes on the surface, really think about the brush strokes. And during the course of this demonstration, I found myself really thinking about the marks that I was making on the surface, even more so than I would with traditional pastels, which I think is important. It's definitely a different approach to creating a pastel drawing, one that requires a little bit more thought and deliberateness with the marks that you make. We'll continue to exploit some of the colors. In this case, I'm going to look for opportunities to make some bold marks of blue in some of the shadowed areas. We'll also continue to darken up some of the shadowed areas as well by adding some more black, and then of course layering a few more indications of detail, in this case some tree trunks here and there. There is a small body of water off in the distance, so we're going to have a little peek of that in the far right part of the pictorial space there. And we're going to define the light sources coming from the left side, which is evident in the reference that I'm working from. So the left side of the trees are going to be lighter in value, also going to be warmer in color temperature, so that's important to keep in mind. There's also a few areas where light is getting in through the bottom portions of the trees. There are also going to be a few areas where we can see the river actually through the bottom portion of the tree, so we'll address that with a bit of white and yellow and maybe some lighter values underneath there. Next, I'm going to introduce a little bit of yellow ochre here and there. We're not going to put it everywhere, we're just going to put it in spots, and it'll actually act as somewhat of a highlight color. It'll play nicely against the blue in the background and also harmonize with the greens, yellows, and blues that are happening in the area of the trees. I'm going to soften up this area where the tree that doesn't have a lot of leaves on it kind of sticks out over the top of the other trees and make it a little softer and more harmonious with the other marks that already exist. Right, when we're somewhat pleased with the middle ground, we're going to go ahead and move on to the foreground. I'll use one of the larger applicators to mix up a few variations of green using the yellow and blue, and just make some bold marks here, just like we did in the sky, to initially put down some color. In the areas where the shadow is a little bit darker, I'll use blue to darken that up. And again, a little bit of blue mixed with the green, some variations. I'm going to try to make some loose brush strokes here. I can also lighten up some of the areas using a little bit of yellow, with just a touch of white in the mixture as well. I'm just going to pull that applicator down much like I would with a brush. There is an area right underneath the tree line where the light's coming through with some intensity, so I'll use a little bit of white mixed with that yellow. Then I'm going to switch over to an applicator that's much like a flat brush and try to harmonize some of the brush strokes that are happening in the trees in the middle ground. We might bring some more color down with that applicator in the foreground. A little bit of yellow mixed with white, and then we'll intensify that bit of light that's happening right at the edge of the tree line. I'm trying to make my brush strokes on the surface and then just leave them alone without working them in too much. A little bit more blue in the middle ground here just to darken up some of the areas of shadow that are happening in the photo reference that are not necessarily translating at this point in the painting, so I'm going to try to push those values a little bit further. I'm also going to mute some of the areas by mixing the black in with the surrounding colors a bit further. I don't want the black to be too strong in the finished painting. And I'm going to intensify some of the areas of highlight just a bit further as well. A little bit of white mixed with green, yellow, and blue. That'll give us a little bit more depth and a little bit more definition between the areas of bushes that are far off in the distance. I'm also going to simplify some of the shapes of the trees a bit further, and then add some areas of highlight here as well. Now there are some areas of light that are getting in through the bottom portions of the trees, as I mentioned before, so I'll start making marks that might indicate some tree trunks that exist between those areas of light. Next, I'm going to use a smaller applicator to create some of the areas of white that might be poking through the breaks in the trees. This is going to help define the form of the shape of the tree a bit further. And we'll do this here and there. It's important that you don't do too much of it so that you make the trees completely disappear. Maybe there's just one more peek of the river through the woods. Now in this dark area there's a bit of white that shouldn't be there, so I'm going to darken that area in. And there's a quick look at using pan pastels to create a landscape. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and I hope it helped you out.